So, welcome back from break, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. First of all, I want to thank you guys all so much for your great questions. We're getting some really good ones, but to help us kind of keep them organized and make sure your question doesn't get lost in the shuffle, please remember to put your question in the Q&A so that Cara is able to find them more easily. We're able to keep track and we don't lose them in the chat. So if you have a specific question for the speaker, not just a comment, then put that in the Q&A. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. McKenna, and she's an acoustic ecologist interested in how sound shapes the world around us. She is currently a researcher at Hopkins Marine Station at Stanford University, located in Pacific Grove, California. She previously worked as a scientist with the National Park Service Science and Stewardship Directorate, assisting parks with understanding and protecting acoustic and nocturnal environments. She received her PhD from Scripps Institution of Oceanography and was a postdoc at the Marine Mammal Commission. Welcome, Dr. McKenna, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the hat and the introduction. I'm going to take a minute here and share my screen. Hopefully you guys can all see it now. Great. Well, it's great to be here today. I hope everyone's doing well in these crazy times. I just also want to extend a big thanks to the organizers of the workshop. I'm sure it wasn't easy going virtual like everything these days. So thank you for making it fun as well, too. So today I'm going to be talking about one main question here: why conservation can benefit from sensory ecology. And I'm going to hit on a couple key points in the presentation, some take-home messages from the talk here. Is first, just highlighting the importance of the sensory environment for many biological functions and ecological interactions. Also, just appreciating the remarkable sensory systems for hearing, and that's bolded because that is most of my background, but also vision and smell across a diversity of terrestrial and aquatic organisms. There's also clear examples of the benefits of reducing sensory pollutants, and I'll highlight some of those examples today. And then one point also is to think about opportunities to integrate with other wildlife disturbance related efforts, thinking about the sensory environment. So as was mentioned in my introduction, I was previous with the National Park Service, Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division, a great group where we were tasked with restoring, maintaining, and protecting acoustical and nocturnal environments. In this agency, I think importantly, it shaped a lot of my thinking on this topic, but as well, like we were thinking about the environment itself as well as the impacts to wildlife and visitors. So while my thinking is shaped by this, I think it's important to know that I'm no longer with the Park Service, so these are my interpretations and don't necessarily reflect the opinions of the Park Service. So while there's guidance out there about protecting hearing, and it's usually thresholds of pain. And so I think one thing to start this off is thinking about preserving opportunities to detect the subtle sounds in nature. This is one of my favorite videos. I can never resist putting it in a presentation. But also thinking about, from the nocturnal perspective, conditions from the base of the food chain through to sea turtles, right? We have to think about collectively how artificial light at night can change all of these interactions. So just keeping in mind that I'm coming from a perspective of preserving these opportunities. Also, another important component, and was touched on early, which I really appreciate in the initial conversation, is thinking about it more integrated, not just the wildlife component, but what are the benefits to the cultural experience? What are the benefits to the educational experience? And of course, the visitor experience as well. And I'll touch on some of these and how they're interrelated. But as a clear example that was recently published in the literature, this is an example in Muir Woods. Maybe some of you have experienced this signage. But what they looked at was how soundscapes can benefit people and wildlife visiting places. And so in order to do this, they put up signage, and they monitored both the visitor experience when that signage was on and not there and there, as well as species richness of different birds in the area. And what they found when the signage was out there, it was a reduction in equivalent to 21% reduction in visitors. Of course, there were still the same amount of visitors there, but just that signage made their activity or the sounds they were making quieter. As well, what they saw is that there is increased number of birds and species richness when visitors were rating the soundscape, it was more pleasant. And there was also a preference for soundscape management. I think this is key because they saw the feasibility of it, right? They were experiencing it, and so they could rate that higher because it was more tangible in that case. So that's just one example of some of this signage in protecting the soundscape or the acoustic environment. I just want to take a step back here and to fully understand sort of the implications of the study and the benefits that can be achieved through protecting the sensory environment is thinking about what's the importance of sensory systems. So I'm just going to highlight a couple examples here. So the first is foraging, and this was a study that was done looking at owl foraging. Basically, the owls are listening for the footfalls of mouse underneath leaf litter, and what you can see in this graphic here is that as noise level increased, their probability of detection, strike, as well as success was reduced with that noise level increase. Habitat selection, there's lots of examples of this. In fact, a paper that just came out showing on a landscape scale how nest selection has been influenced by the sensory environment. This was a specific study that looked at nest box occupancy as well as condition of the nestling. And as noise levels increased, the number of nests went down, as well as the conditions of the offspring. So it was not only habitat selection, what habitats they were selecting, but also the condition of the offspring. So clear importance of using the sensory environment to protect their habitat. Another example is risk assessment. So in this case, the park was interested in understanding how visitor noise was influencing nesting cormorants. And what we found here in this study is that the probability of a disturbance goes up with noise level, right? So they'll exhibit more fluttering and flying, which is probably to be expected. But how risk comes in here, some of these different lines on this graphic, when gulls were present, that behavior increased even more, so higher probability. So when you had the noise and the gulls present. So I think this just speaks to their sort of assessing the risk in their environment, their nest predator. So those are just a few examples of it. But the literature is rich on this topic and extensive. And so this is just kind of showing you that in a graphic form, right? So we've seen an increase in the number of publications over the last number of years, with 50% of the papers being published in the last 5 years. So a significant increase. And also speaks to sort of keeping up on some of the opportunities that are out there for different species. On the lighting front, this is another publication that just looked at the number, 117 different species that respond to artificial light at night. This is shown by phases of the moon because we can kind of understand that light level, but it is artificial light and how they are responding. So a variety of taxa across a variety of behaviors as well. One of the first steps in trying to make informed decisions about how to protect the sensory environment is really understanding the existing conditions. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of spatial tools that are available that this group might be interested in. And these are put out by the National Park Service. So this is a geospatial model, we call it, because it's a predictive model of what the sound levels would be across the continental United States, using on-the-ground measurements paired with features of the landscape to be able to predict that. The cool thing about the predictive framework, not only is it based on real measurements, but also we can then estimate what quote unquote natural sounds levels are. And this is particularly important in the coastal environment, right? Because we have surf noise. Noise levels are naturally elevated in these areas. So when we're looking at trying to understand how much noise human activity might be adding to that environment, it's good to understand what that baseline is. Further with this modeling approach, we can zoom in. So this is a close-up of San Francisco Bay, well, greater area here, and you can see the natural levels across this landscape. It's a 250-meter resolution in that data. So some great spatial tools to be able to look at, well, what are the sensory conditions in terms of acoustic conditions. On the lighting front, there's a global map of artificial sky brightness. These models are based on satellite imagery, so looking at upward spreading of light from the landscape, a lot of these images you've seen, but also it integrates on-the-ground measurements to be able to understand how those are related in that case. And so this is just showing you the sky brightness from that model for the continental United States. I'll put all these links in the panel that they shared afterwards, so if you don't be frantically writing down any of these links if you're interested. So 2020 has been an interesting and challenging year, to say the least. And some researchers have been going out and trying to understand, well, what does this mean for wildlife? And I know the group has talked a lot about how this has changed visitation, but there has been some opportunities, and maybe some of you are involved in this as well, of what might be the benefits to wildlife to be able to understand when we're changing these conditions. It's sort of a natural experiment setting. So this was a paper that was looked at the quiet spring of 2020 in San Francisco. And what they saw is that when noise was reduced, and they've been monitoring these urban birds for decades, and what they saw is they returned to their high performing songs and increased their communication range by over twice the distance. So a pretty dramatic change in their acoustic ecology, or how they're communicating, how they're finding mates. And I think the most important thing of this study is that it was a fast return to pre-exposure conditions, suggesting no legacy effects, like other pollutants that we might see in the environment. And so I think this speaks to sort of, when we reduce that pollutant, we can have immediate benefits if we can do it sustainably. And I think that's the challenge, right? The pandemic is not necessarily a way to move forward to protect wildlife, as we know, but there are opportunities for conservation. And how can we do this more sustainably and moving forward? And I already mentioned some signage, so this just shows that signage there. But a couple other examples I just wanted to highlight. There's been some work done in Rock Creek Park, and this is in Washington, D.C., where they close the road on the weekend, which is the main thoroughfare of traffic into the city. And it was to benefit weekend recreators, right? So they had that road to be able to recreate on. And then researchers went out and looked at, well, what does this mean for the songbird community, particularly breeding birds? And what they found, similar to the San Francisco study, is that they returned to their optimal state when the noise was reduced on these weekends. So it provided opportunities for more effective communication. And so you could think about how targeted or periodic closures might benefit both the wildlife as well as people using the area. So that's just one example of sort of the wildlife-human benefit there. Another example is quiet technology. There's lots of technology out there. The one that I'm showing here is that there is, this is a backup beeper in Denali National Park. Denali is a very, very quiet place otherwise. And so these backup beepers were audible at a range of more than 2 miles, which is clearly not needed for safety. And so what they were able to do by changing the acoustics of that backup beeper, they reduced that area by 50% that was audible. It's actually easier for humans to localize on that type of sound source. It's all compliant with safety standards, which is a very important component of this. And the cost for some budgets, this might be reasonable, $143 per vehicle. And so we got a dramatic improvement from one sound source, but in this environment that does tend to annoy visitors as well as staff in the park. On the lighting front, there's examples, and I think the lighting front I also want to touch on is that there's a lot of cities that are moving towards, communities that are moving towards solid state lighting. And there's a big push for this of energy efficiency, which is fantastic. We just have to be a little bit careful of what that means in terms of the light that is being emitted and how that might influence people as well as wildlife. And so this is a group called Birdcast, where they provide real-time predictions of bird migration, shown in the map on the upper corner, and it's based on over 20 years of radar data. So the weather folks are interested in, well, the clouds and the precipitation, but in that same data set, there's also migrating birds, particularly migrating birds at night. And we know at night, a lot of songbirds are migrating, it attracts them, it disorients them, and it can exhaust them and make them more vulnerable to other threats like collision and predators. And so what this group has done is try to establish a lights out alert, so different communities can get involved in this, or you as a citizen can go and log on like I did last night, although they're done now. There's no more alerts that are going to be coming out for the season, but starting up again in March, we'll have these come back up. But you can type in your county and sort of figure out, you know, are there birds likely to be migrating through this area, and can do some targeted light out, of course, keeping in mind the safety component of this as well. So this is just an example from the artificial light at night opportunities for preserving this nighttime environment. There's also lighting retrofits, and as I mentioned, this is happening on city level. This was an example in Grand Teton National Park. I bring up this because it was really excessive lighting in a dark area. Of course, there's safety concerns here, but we could see these lights from space in an otherwise very dark environment. And there was also a concern from the park of the spread of white nose syndrome in bats. And so the park really wanted to see how could we change some of this lighting through intensity and also color of the lighting, and also do it so it's more energy efficient. And so this is just showing you a before and after. This is still underway. They're looking at evaluating biological, ecological response as well as human response to different lighting colors, right? A visitor might not feel as safe in this type of color. And so there's a lot of work being done to sort of tease apart what is the best way forward for the lighting here. It's also really cool remote capabilities. So different times of year, it can be changed based on what the conditions are in the environment. So I think this is a really cool example of more of a localized, but a needed place where they can really experiment and understand visitor and wildlife response to those lighting changes. So when we're thinking about outdoor lighting, I think I just want to point out that, of course, energy efficiency is a part of it, but there's also some principles, and this is put out by the International Dark Sky Association, as well as the division I was formerly associated with in the National Park Service, right, to light only if, when, and where needed. Shielding lights is really important, so directing that light where you want it to be, minimizing the amount of light. So sometimes when you go from to solid state lighting, you keep the intensity the same, but we know LEDs are brighter, and so you could decrease that wattage. Of course, using energy efficient lamp and fixtures, and considering the human visual performance, right? When you have a huge contrast from light to dark, there's actually hard for us to adjust, or our perception of safety is reduced in that case. And so there's some principles out there that can be followed when trying to think about this more sustainably and more holistically. So just to summarize, I just want to highlight that we do know the impacts. There's extensive scientific literature on the effects of noise and artificial light on wildlife that we can take advantage of to understand what are the opportunities to protect these environments. And there are examples where there's benefits to human and wildlife. And I think I highlighted some of those examples, and there's likely more out there as tools for moving forward. I also highlighted some spatial tools that are available to help understand conditions and inform strategies. Measurements are always a possibility, and there's just measuring these conditions can be, well, it takes some thinking behind it in terms of making accurate measurements that are comparable, but definitely in some cases before or after measurements are important. And then just hitting home that point of considering the sensory environment when designing or promoting other disturbance efforts. With that, I just thank you for your time, and I think I saw some questions come in, so I can touch on those. Let's see, where are they?
Okay, thanks, Megan. I have some questions for you from the group. Amanda says, it seems like National Park Service's Dark Skies is really taking the lead on lighting and noise disturbance. Is there any other organization that is working on this issue as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is the International Dark Sky Association. So they certify parks or protected areas. So they're definitely another leader in it. There's also guidance out there from other federal agencies. So I know Bureau of Land Management also has some guidance out there, especially when you're lighting oil and gas fields, which is maybe not the case here. In terms of the noise front, yes, there's less effort in terms of that. There's the Gordon Hampton 1 square inch of silence, so very much an advocacy for protecting that silence. But in terms of on the ground, particularly in the United States, really I do agree that the Park Service is in that division is leading that effort, and important to look to them for moving forward and some of the different examples that they're using to do that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any studies on sound effect on harbor seal pups?
gosh, there's a lot of studies out there. I know there are overflights, particularly, what's coming to my mind now is walrus, which doesn't pertain to here, but yes, you can increase the disturbance behaviors. I'll have to get back to you on that exact study, but yes, there's a lot of, especially pinnipeds for in air and in water studies. So yes, if I can get that contact, I can probably send that information to you. I can't think about the top of my head, but definitely looking at, well, the one thing that a lot of studies have done is look at auditory capabilities. And so you can understand, when animals are able to hear that sound, and then you can sort of translate that into a behavioral response as well.
Awesome. Thank you for that. There's a comment. It just says Cambria on the Central Coast is working on a dark sky initiative. That's cool. I didn't know that. So thank you, Sharon, for posting that. Great. Well, thank you so much, Megan. If we have more questions, we'll get them out to you. And if you want to share anything about marine mammal studies and sound, it could go on our Padlet that we
yeah, great. And I'll put links to any of the websites I mentioned, as well as some of the publications if you're interested as well too. I'll put those on lunch over on the board. Thank you for doing that. That's
You're getting a lot of appreciation. It's a very interesting topic and very timely. So really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. All right.
Okay, thank you